Welcome to Climate Channel, Climate Conversation with Quamrul Chowdhury, Climate Action Pathways, episode 56. In this episode of Climate Channel, Climate Conversation, we are going to discuss on our road to Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27, to be hosted in Egypt come November 2022. What have we done in Glasgow COP26 is now a part of the history. Yes, we have progressed in some of the agenda items, but in some others, we couldn't make substantive progresses. So hopefully at Sharm el-Sheikh, down the road, we can achieve that next year, next November. So what is our expectation along our pathway to Sharm el-Sheikh? Is it an African COP? Is it an adaptation COP? What about adaptation finance? What about overall climate finance? What about NDCs, emission reduction? What about net zero? Yes, at Glasgow, we have decided to come back to Sharm el-Sheikh with a revised NDCs. That means revision of our ambitions, upward revision, that means. So will that keep alive 1.5 degree climate regime of Paris Agreement alive? Will that be sufficient enough? What about carbon emission, carbon pricing, carbon trading? What about Article 6? Can the rule book, Paris rule book or Katowice rule book be executed right earnestly? How to solidify that? With all these questions, I would now like to ask Tomasz. Poland had hosted most of the conference of the parties, COPs, and you have presided over SBI, Substar, and also were in adaptation committee, in other committees also, a long history. So with your wide experience of conference of parties, SBs, what is your take? What is your reflection? What is your advice for the mankind?
Okay, how much time you give me?
Yeah. Okay, Tomasz.
Okay, well, let me put it this way. More I'm thinking of it, more I'm convinced that we should not be planning any African, Asian, European, whatever COP, but we should rather start thinking about conference of parties. We should start thinking about the meeting that has a very important task ahead. First of all, to take stock of how successful we are in implementing all the rule books that have already been decided, adopted. Well, they are not perfect. We all know that the decisions neither from Katowice nor from Glasgow are perfect, but we have these decisions, and the most important test of whether they work or not would be to start doing the job and learning from doing rather than learning from talking. we are very good in talking. So that's from my perspective, probably the most important task. The second most important. So we will have two most important tasks ahead of COP27 is to start preparation ahead of the global stocktake that is planned for 2023. That will be the task for COP28 in Dubai, if I'm not mistaken. And
in Dubai, yeah.
Yeah, and this process, well, we all remember how much time we used to have the Talanoa dialogue. The Talanoa dialogue that was meant to be something like, let's say, test field ahead of the global stocktake, that was meant to enable conversations between parties, between the stakeholders, and this format that Fijian presidency developed worked very well. Whether that would be something similar or we would need something else, that is for parties to decide. And this decision has to be taken in Sharm el-Sheikh. And this decision has to be well prepared ahead of Sharm el-Sheikh. So we won't waste time on unnecessary debating dots and commas. You mentioned adaptation. I think that, well, we've had already many discussions. We got lots of reports, including the recent IPCC report on scientific basis of climate change. So we know that there is too much of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and not only carbon, but non-carbon gases as well. And if we look at the curve, how the concentration of methane raises, that is really worrying, and that will deserve much more attention than anybody would be willing to pay to this problem, because everybody is focusing on carbon emissions, carbon trading, blah, blah, blah. Methane is the problem. Nitric oxide is the problem. Nitrous oxide is a problem. So we have to look very carefully on what is happening in this non-carbon part of the equation. And last but not least, adaptation, resilience, it's linked with risk management, it links with desertification, it links with nature-based solutions. So I think that the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, being so wonderfully placed on the Red Sea, could be the one that opens up to looking for more synergies between Rio conventions, in particular the Convention on Biodiversity and Convention on Combating Desertification. These three together could contribute to bringing back the balance between the elements of climate system. And it would be good if we could, after Sharm el-Sheikh, restart our perception that climate is what some wise people call life support system of this planet. That climate has to be seen holistically from the point of view of biosphere, geosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere, and not only from the perspective of greenhouse gas emissions. So that would be my take on what we need to do before Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomasz, for your initial reflection. I would now ask Joshep Richardson. Joe, what is your advice? what is your say take, especially on our road to Sharm el Sheikh, next 12 months, 11
Thank you,
months,
Quamrul.
precisely 11 months.
Thank you, Quamrul. And I'd like to just go back to something that Tomasz mentioned regarding the Talanoa dialogue. One of the outcomes of the COP26 was a Glasgow work program on action for climate empowerment. And at Citizens Climate International, we've been advocates for a long time for enhanced, everyday, ongoing engagement of the general public in policymaking. We see that as the best interpretation of the original intent of Article 6 of the Convention on Action for Climate Empowerment. We also see it as necessary for getting to locally rooted economic development that is climate smart and resilience building. It's much easier to do those kind of things in collaboration with people where they live, in the context that they know, with the capabilities that they have, rather than to try to guess or estimate or invest to build those things in a way that might not be suited to the local situation. So we see the activation of the Glasgow Work Programme, the SB 56, as a critical piece of the puzzle for raising ambition. If you look back to 2014, 2015, in the run-up to the Sustainable Development Goals, the lesson from the My World survey was that when you talk to stakeholders, ambition goes up significantly. People generally feel that policy and investment and economics should be good for them, good for everybody, and sustainable. It is seen by most people as unreasonable and illogical to make investments that are destructive or temporary and don't solve major problems. So we see engagement as critical. The next thing, I think, again, what Tomasz mentioned about resilience and the holistic approach to the climate, we still have this problem where we talk about the climate system and climate disruption and climate emergency as if it were only part of what we have to deal with.
Joe, are you? Have we lost Joe? Okay.
That's something that touches everything.
Yeah, Joe, continue.
Sorry about that. I don't know where you lost me. But I was saying, anyone who's looked at the science, whether it's the first time or whether they're an expert, seen that the IPCC is calling for action, because if we don't make this better, we can expect multiple breadbasket failure within 2 decades. If that happens, the scale of economic disruption, the scale of human suffering, the scale of mass migration will be completely unmanageable. There are no institutions that exist right now that can deal with that level of emergency. So that holistic approach is essential, not only for how we think about the climate, but how we invest in everything, whether we're thinking about it as a climate investment or not. If we're going to make investments in infrastructure or food systems, we have to be thinking about how we're performing against this global resilience imperative. And then I think, something I'd like to highlight is, I think it matters that Article 6.8, paragraph 8 of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement now has rules for cooperative implementation. That is a way for countries to essentially come together around policies that allow them to enhance their overall emissions reduction, but without emissions trading. That means carbon taxes and returning revenues to households, shifting subsidies, direct climate investments, nature-based solutions. All of those things can go forward in a way that is spontaneous, voluntary, creative, collaborative, and rigorous, following the standard of no double counting, no backsliding, and also working towards overall mitigation of global emissions. I think if we take these things together, engagement, resilience, and that opportunity for creative collaborative implementation, then real forward motion on climate smart food systems that deliver finance to small farmers across Africa and other vulnerable regions. These can be things that help to raise ambition at COP27 in a major way.
Thank you, Joe. Joanna, how do you foresee Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 come November? What is your reflection? What take?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to present my take on it. And the wonderful thing about coming last is that I get to agree with everything that the previous speakers have said. And I'd like to pick up on a couple of those points. I think you're absolutely right, Quamrul, to encourage us to look ahead now. But I think it's also important to look back on where we're coming from. And I think in Glasgow, we have really a very good platform for our future work going forwards to Sharm el-Sheikh. I think, like many people, I was quite pleasantly surprised at how successful Glasgow was in many respects. And at the beginning, you said we need to solidify the gains in Glasgow. And I think that's absolutely true. In a sense, the gains we have are future promises, and we now have to turn them into reality. I think Tomasz said that we're good at talking at COPs. We're also very good at making promises. But what we need to do now is really pin those promises down, and there has to be this focus on implementation. A couple of things just to draw out from Glasgow. There was a very good negotiating atmosphere, I thought, in Glasgow. I thought parties were there with a constructive spirit, and I'd really like to see that continue towards Sharm el-Sheikh. There's a number of reasons why that was, and we need to ensure that that carries on, because that really enables us to engage in substantive negotiation without all these procedural wranglings that Tomasz, you said we need to try and avoid. And that, to a large extent, is due to advance preparation. So let's make sure that that is locked in as well. In Glasgow, we saw a real recognition and respect for the science, which wasn't the case, for example, in Madrid. And I'd like to see that continue as well. And just to draw participants' attention to the fact that the IPCC will be releasing its next two working group reports. So obviously on impacts and then on mitigation going forward. So delegates at Sharm el-Sheikh will have those in hand, and I think they'll be very important. One thing we haven't mentioned is my view that Glasgow did keep 1.5 alive. And in fact, I think it emphasised and solidified 1.5 as the mainstream goal. No one is talking about well below 2. We're now for 1.5, and we really do need to build on that. Glasgow also, to me, showed that the COP process is capable of some quite major breakthroughs. And I must say, having followed the COP since COP1, sometimes I doubt that. There seems to be a lot of repetition of the same ideas and thoughts. But at Glasgow, we saw the mention of coal in the decision, fossil fuel subsidies, completely new. We saw a real focus on methane. And Tomasz, I think you are so right in pointing out the importance of methane. And that was there. We never really saw that before, this focus on non-CO2 gases. That's great. And nature-based solutions. I know they weren't called nature-based solutions, but that's what they were alluding to. So we have had those three breakthroughs, and I think it's important to bear those in mind and to build on them. In Glasgow, we also had the various side declarations, many of them promoted by the UK presidency. I think the UK presidency must be pushed and encouraged to monitor what happens with those. We can't just let them disappear. We had many countries agreeing to a lot of progressive things. We need to ensure that just doesn't disappear. And that's up to the UK presidency, and myself and others need to push the presidency on that. Now going forwards, something really positive I saw from Glasgow was the way it set out very clear pathways on developing country concerns, on adaptation, on climate finance, on loss and damage. Now, I know there was disappointment that the gains weren't as concrete as certain people would have hoped. I think maybe that was a bit unrealistic, but what I see are detailed, very detailed processes that can be built upon. And I especially, I think, on climate finance. So I really hope to see that going forwards. For me, Sharm el-Sheikh and going forwards to 2024 is a real opportunity to put these developing country concerns front and center. And they're not just developing country concerns, I shouldn't really say that, but it's a kind of package of issues that really helps to respond to worries about climate impacts and about the lack of climate finance. There's now the opportunity to really focus on those. You know, we have the Paris Law Book done. Now the negotiating energy can focus on that. And I'm really glad that the global stocktake has been mentioned, because I think that is really critical. I think the Talanoa dialogue precedent is a good one, but having said that, I would like to see stronger outcomes coming out of the global stocktake, because I think the Talanoa dialogue, the process was great. I'm not entirely sure that the outcome really had the traction that it needed. So if there could be some thought amongst negotiators as to what we actually want to see as the products coming out of that, not just to focus on the process, I think that would be really valuable as well. So I think I'll stop there for now, but I'll look forward to reacting to anything else that comes up in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. I would now like to ask Joe, so how do we can fix the global adaptation goal? Because that is a task we have to accomplish down the road in Sharm el-Sheikh and also go beyond. Then also how to fix what is climate finance, what is adaptation finance, whether it is new and additional, whether it is over and above ODA, whether it is grant one, how are we going to, and public finance, how do we are going to fix that, define climate finance, whether resilience is alone adaptation, or we have to go beyond resilience building, beyond capacity building, whether community-based adaptation or ecosystem-based adaptation, blah, blah, arena for adaptation. Adaptation means the adaptive capacity to changing climate. So how far we can adapt, and where is peak shock, where loss and damage trigger beyond adaptation. So these challenges we have to face now while we are defining adaptation global goal and also fixing adaptation finance and climate finance. Joe.
Thank you, Quamrul. And I'm going to start by saying I think that maybe the road to understanding both the global goal on adaptation and finance questions is to think about what we mean by resilience. I like the way that, certain people in the International Monetary Fund talk about macro critical resilience. So is a society positioned to survive climate shocks? Is it positioned to deal with economic disruption? Does it have that adaptive capacity? The Sustainable Development Goals are a good map of macro critical resilience indicators. If we develop an integrated metric that allows us to understand which countries are best at achieving macro critical resilience for their whole population, then we might have a very easy way to define what is the best kind of climate finance and what is a good goal for adaptation globally. But in the absence of that, yeah. Yes. Is the sound all right? Do we have sound?
I think maybe Quamrul is offline. I'm not sure. I think he
Okay.
seems to have frozen.
I'll continue.
Yeah.
So if we think about climate finance as something that needs to build resilience, build adaptive capacity, and also eliminate climate threats from our overall economy, then we start to get to a place where climate finance can be mainstream finance, where we don't need to say that we need dedicated additional finance, or, you know, dedicated additional money is like saying money that doesn't exist. That's why it's hard to find. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be sought and dedicated, but we need all money to be avoiding climate damage. We need all money that moves through any economy to be on the right side instead of the wrong side. Some of the things we have to do to get there are to redefine what we mean by financial risk. It's obvious that major shocks are costing nations trillions of dollars now, whereas a few years ago, that was not yet true. As the climate crisis deepens and those major shocks proliferate in number and in variety, we need to be able to understand what a good investment for the future looks like in an environment where no one knows exactly what might happen. That means we can't just be lean. We can't just be focused on financial bottom line efficiency. We can't think only about the life of capital. We have to think about the whole society. And so mainstreaming climate finance is critical. And then, you know, the global goal on adaptation, I think the thing that nobody, at least I haven't heard anyone say, people seem to want to avoid this question. The most reasonable goal as a global goal on adaptation is zero vulnerability. No one anywhere being vulnerable to human-caused climate impacts. That requires us to solve climate change, of course, but it also requires us to directly invest in building adaptive capacity, building resilience, protecting people against unnecessary and preventable harm. Another way to look at it would be to say that adaptive capacity can somehow be measured, but that's challenging because in different contexts, that looks different. So to come up with one universal standard is complicated. I think the conversation about the global goal on adaptation is going to actually yield some of these potential breakthroughs that you mentioned, Joanna, because we will have to at some point reckon with the challenge of either saying we want zero vulnerability and zero harm, or we're willing to accept some vulnerability and some harm. And then we start having the conversation about equity and who is supposed to take on that vulnerability and that harm. In Glasgow, we saw, you know, the financing facility for loss and damage pushed back if it were somehow an inconvenience or not a priority. And within days of that, we saw the United States government delivering emergency rescue assistance to people in multiple states because of extreme weather, clearly exacerbated by climate change. Some of those very people who absolutely should have that assistance are among the people who participate in an economy that is generating climate damage for people all over the world. So we have to start looking at how these things are similar and connected. If we're going to rescue people in Kentucky or Louisiana or Washington State from climate damage, if we're going to help them recover, then we need to look at loss and damage as a similar problem. There has to be a way to make people whole. There has to be a way to get people back up to baseline resilience so that when we talk about their adaptive capacity and we talk about the ability to build a climate smart future, everybody is starting with capability instead of starting in a hole, starting with extreme traumatic damage that will last for generations. We have to see this as a global cooperative endeavor where no one should be abandoned. And so I think the global goal on adaptation, getting to that global goal, figuring out what that looks like, is going to help us solve some of these other problems and simply recognize that it's smarter and more efficient and more effective to just get the money where it needs to go so that we get to an overall climate smart future faster.
I think we seem to have lost our chair, our facilitator. Maybe the best thing we can do, since the recording is continuing, should we maybe react? Oh no, here we are. Quamrul's back, I think.
Sorry. Sorry, I lost my connectivity. So, Zoe is here.
That's all right. So I continued mine. I continued my intervention. I can summarize very, very briefly, Quamrul, for your sake, if you like. You know, I said that I think we have to think about macro-critical resilience, the resilience of the whole society. We have to think about finance that helps to achieve that. So all money needs to be avoiding climate damage, building resilience. And then the global goal on adaptation, really, it needs to be zero vulnerability. I mean, that's the most reasonable, most ethical, most principled approach. The problem is how hard it will be to achieve that. And I think that in the conversations about how we get there and how we define the global goal on adaptation, what is the 1.5 equivalent for adaptation, we're going to start solving some problems that relate to, are we willing to say that some places should receive climate impact recovery funds like Kentucky or Louisiana, and some places that are seeking loss and damage for extreme impacts that have devastated whole societies somehow are not eligible. We're going to start solving some of those problems, because once we realize that no one should be vulnerable, that what you see in the preamble of the Glasgow Pact, human rights and the right to health, these things are interconnected. It's just going to be seen as smarter to get the money where it needs to go, get everybody to where they need to be to act properly on climate.
Okay, thank you, Joe, for your quite elaborate reflection on how we can fix global adaptation goal and also define climate finance, and also practical solutions, advices. Thomas, I would like to ask you how we can say phase out or phase down, say fossil fuel coal, and how fast that transition can happen, and how to say also align climate finance along that way, how to also say price carbon and equity, justice portion can also be addressed, because in some of the countries we see, say for South Africa, say price of carbon is like say 40 cents per ton, but in Sweden say 100 euros. So these disparity, these say anomalies, these distortions, how best we can phase out or phase down. Thomas.
Well, it's not an easy question. Well, the problem here is that every time we are discussing price on carbon, we are in fact discussing how much the society can pay for energy, can pay for fuels, can pay for food, because it's obvious content of the energy price in price that we pay for food, etc., etc. So if we are discussing the transition, any transition, we need to take into account the society and its ability to sustain the higher cost of living, or the cost of transforming the way they live, the efficiency of their living, in a way that the higher energy price would not directly translate into as high cost of living. So this social dimension of transition and social dimension of climate change needs to be very carefully considered, needs to be remembered, and needs to be monitored to be able to react. You mentioned nearly €100 price in Sweden. That's the reality for the entire EU. That's not just for Sweden. And Sweden, in fact, is the country that probably, I'm not sure, but the data that I know indicate that Sweden is probably the most carbon neutral out of all the EU. So the carbon content in their energy mix is just minimum. For the country like Sweden, the price of CO2 allowance is, yeah, it is the cost, but it's not devastating cost. For the country like mine, the price of CO2 right now is unfortunately causing very high energy prices. And we have to take into account that even though the political decisions have been taken to change the energy mix, at the same time, while changing energy mix, each country, each government has to secure the supply of energy to the economy, to people, etc., etc., etc. So this is easy to say, but the process itself has to take into account the circumstances, has to take into account what is the point of exit for the transition, and has to take into account overall level of wealth that the people living in a country may, let's say, sacrifice in order to become more climate friendly, more efficient, etc., etc., etc. So that is probably not exactly the response that you could have expected, but we are talking about decades rather than years, and this process will need to be initiated. This is important. And it's very good reference in our climate convention, Kyoto protocols, or Paris Agreement, both the treaties itself and also in the decision, the reference to equity. What is the difference between equity and equality? Well, equality in this case may mean discrimination of some nations. Can you imagine the guy in the Republic of South Africa having to pay €100 per ton of CO2? I cannot. The equitable approach means that those who can afford investing more do it now, and everybody else is catching up. So everybody else is catching up. So we can deliver on what Paris Agreement wants us to deliver, and what science in the report confirmed as the necessary goal for the world, not for this or that country. And we all contribute to damaging environment. Some contribute a lot and some contribute a little. And we have to start contributing to let's say, helping the situation. But it's not an easy process, and it's not short-term planning. It's strategic planning.
Long-term, yeah, strategic planning and long-term planning. Thank you, Thomas. I would now like to go to Joanna. You have been in this process since COP1. So, like a fossil, like me, I have been since the INC days. But we have seen a lot of ups and downs, even in Glasgow. And you know, COP26 presidency will continue till next year, till Sharm el-Sheikh, and have to work together with Egyptian co-presidency next 11 months, so that the transition to COP27 is quite smooth. And we know that we have before us a lot of homework, a lot of say dialogues, a lot of say roundtables, a lot of workshops, a lot of even in sessions, SBs. So how best we can put the presidencies on the toes so that they can deliver, and also the process, as our great friend Peter Bears always said, process in this process is substance. Many a times process dictates. If the process is not inclusive one, participatory, fully participatory one, then cracks develop. Risks are in abundance. So how to avoid those risks, those kinky pathways, right from now up till November next? Joanna, the challenges for the current COP presidency and incoming COP presidency.
Yes, thank you, Quamrul. It's quite fun to be described as a fossil. I think all those years since COP1 have passed really very quickly, and I like to remind my students and people who've only just become involved in the process of how much progress the UNFCCC has actually made over the past 30 years. Because of course, next year it'll be the 30-year anniversary of the adoption of the convention. And I know it sometimes seems as if we move at a glacial pace and the same debates are being rehearsed over and over again. But if you actually look at where we were 30 years ago and where we are now, tremendous progress has been made. And I think it's important to recognise and value that progress while also recognising how much needs to be done. And I think you certainly placed your finger on the really important point now, which is how the UK presidency, working with the Egyptian presidency, how it really capitalizes on those gains in Glasgow. And I think I started to allude to that a little bit in my opening statements. I think there's some very specific things that need to be done. There is, of course, this request in the Glasgow Climate Pact for countries to revisit and strengthen their targets within the NDCs. And that's something I really think the UK presidency needs to use every diplomatic tool in its armoury to really try and get key countries to improve on those targets. I think it will be difficult. I think, unfortunately, quite a few countries have already established that they are not going to improve on their NDCs, that they have already said our NDCs are fair and equitable and maximum ambition. We are not going to improve on that. And that would not be a good situation, to be honest, to go into Sharm el-Sheikh. If Sharm el-Sheikh opens and we only have a handful of small island developing states or LDCs who are improving, that will not look good. So I think the UK presidency really needs to work on that one. I've already mentioned all the different side declarations on zero emission vehicles, on coal, on methane, although that was a US-EU one. All these, the UK presidency has got to be able to go to Sharm el-Sheikh at the opening, report back. I would like to see Alok Sharma, the president, report back. Yes, we now have more signatories to these declarations. Yes, we now have this monitoring process in place to make sure countries do what they said they were going to do, to make sure they actually deliver. And I think that's really, really very important. There are, of course, all these workshops and roundtables that you've alluded to. They will need a lot of work. And there, I think there's the two presidencies that are involved. Also the Climate Change Secretariat, of course, in Bonn. And what we need to see is a very good three-way cooperation between those presidencies and the Secretariat. And I would also point out the important role of the UN Secretary General and his office, which I think we'll all agree has been a very progressive force, I think, in seeking to boost ambition and just building bridges between maybe different countries, different coalitions that aren't used to work together. So with the UNSG there, we need presidencies and the Secretariat. Now, the question is how to push those actors to take their responsibilities with the seriousness that they deserve. And I think that there needs to be a demand from delegations, that there needs to be a demand from key negotiating groups like the LDCs. They need to email the UK presidency. They need to say, look, you know, what are you doing now? You know, okay, it's January 2022. We're ready for work. You know, we need to start now. And I really hope there's going to be that demand from the community in the UK. I can assure you that there are already plans afoot to make sure that the presidency team in the UK stays strong and stays focused and doesn't dissipate. We do have a slight problem, I must say, in my country at the moment, that when issues are not being highlighted in the media, they tend to lose a lot of the political attention. So that's something certainly for us in the UK, we need to keep climate change at the very top of the agenda so that our government sees the value in continuing with its presidency right until the very first day of Sharm el-Sheikh. Is that all I wanted to say? Oh, and I also wanted to point out just one very small thing, just building on what Joe said, is the role of the climate champions. So the climate champions, I think they've had their mandate renewed. There's a new impetus to what they do, to collaboration with the climate empowerment. And I'd like to see that process also continue with even more gusto, as we say in the UK, than it has before. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna, for your articulation. I would now like to ask Joe, say United States is under, say, Donald Trump, or say push factor. In fact, that had withdrawn from Paris Agreement, and that also say had lot of adverse impacts in the climate negotiation and also climate actions across the world, because a lot of cutbacks of climate finance and also negative attitude at that point of time by the delegation of the United States in climate parlance. So how best, say, Joe Biden, he came back, returned to, say, Paris Agreement on day one of his presidency. But the, say, leaders summit he convened was some kind of galvanized some momentum, but some of the momentum by now lost. So how to regain that momentum, quadruple the efforts of US presidency and his team, so that in a very positive atmosphere, we can go to Sharm el-Sheikh and also come up with a revised upward indices, ambitions, and also some nature-based solutions, global cooperation, support in terms of adaptation finance, in terms of NDCs, in terms of say mitigation collaboration across the globe, because United States had a leadership role. So that leadership role was missing for 5 long years. How to cope up that? How to accelerate this new phase so that implementation of Paris Agreement is a robust one, on a robust architecture from now on to Sharm el-Sheikh, to Dubai and Eastern Europe, COP29 up till next 3 years down the road under, say, Joe Biden's presidency? Joe to Joe Biden.
So, of course, it's wonderful. It was incredible news when President Biden was elected by a record number of American voters and was able to bring us back into the Paris Agreement. But I think the key for our country to have more consistency on climate, first we have to recognize that Donald Trump is a liar. He lied for many, many years about very serious things. And those lies were programmed to do very specific things. All of his lies seem to have in common the desire to convince people that something that will cause them grave harm and injury isn't really their matter to be concerned with. Nothing to worry about. And whether that was climate or COVID or democracy or the abuse of public office for private gain, in every case, it was an attempt to cause people to look away from looking after their own interests and from using self-government in the right way. So one thing is we have to kind of recognize that many of the people who supported him were the targets of that coordinated campaign of unaccountable harm. Second, we should look back at the US Constitution. Donald Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement or claimed he was trying to do that somehow. The US never stopped attending COPs. The State Department continued participating in the COP process. The reason for that is that the convention is a ratified treaty, which under Article 6 of the United States Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The mandate that we, as an Annex 1 country, end climate change, whether we have the help of China and India or other non-Annex 1 countries or not, that mandate is constitutional law in the United States. So there's not really a way around that responsibility. The Paris Agreement makes it easier for us to actually achieve that mission. This should be a big project for the American people. This should be something that everybody everywhere is excited about and signed up to and committed to make work the way that we wanted to, end totalitarianism as a threat. Part of that problem of President Trump's lies and propaganda is that what he was trying to achieve was appeasement of an absolutely horrific threat. He was trying to cause us not to confront a major threat that will destabilize nations all over the world, possibly ours as well. I think that if we're going to consolidate this commitment that we see from one side of the American political spectrum, we need people in their everyday lives to understand how it connects to them. And so even as we see people driving through fire and, swimming down streets to try to get to their belongings as they float away or rescue a family member, even as we see those things happening, most people still haven't lived through the worst. And so it's not enough that people see that bad things happen. We also have to be thinking about how climate action makes lives better. And we need to be thinking very, very concretely about how we solve problems in a practical way that is not ideological. There should be no reason why your political preferences cause you not to want to deal with climate change, right? Some members of the United States Senate who have historically denounced the delivery of emergency funding for communities affected by climate damage sent very warm and respectful letters to President Biden asking for assistance for their states and their communities. We need to get a better sense of how our everyday lives are affected by this, and the things we do to solve climate change liberate us and protect us. And we need to do it in a way where it's a big national project, but not a sort of centralized top-down kind of thing. And I think that is probably a good example for people around the world. You know, the US is a very closely watched government. There are a lot of countries that haven't attempted to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, but they have done everything they can with the instruments of government power to avoid doing anything. So I think connect people to the problem, connect the solutions to making lives better, and make it a big national project that isn't one top-down uniform strategy, but is an overall sort of mission for improving lives.
Yeah, and also as far as participation of Southern delegations, Southern and Southern academic institutions, research bodies, farmers, community people, indigenous people. Even today, say African Roundtable was held at Cairo. They were especially the academics, the NGOs, the youth representatives, they were accusing even the Southern delegations that they didn't have support for their, say, academic institutions, organizations, youths, and also the COP host, UK, Presidency, and also US and other European Union and others who used to support their participation in the past. This time they didn't come up in that way. Though there were 40,000 participation, but mostly from developed north, not developing south. And that also angered today at African Roundtable. I have heard that because I also registered there. I listened to them. So it was quite shocking to know that they came up with all the figures, how their participation were blocked, where they were deprived of their participation at Glasgow COP. So at Sharm el-Sheikh, my appeal to you three, through you to all, that participation of the Southern people, their delegation, including youth, academic, research organization, civil society bodies, farmers, indigenous people, and all constituents. And that participation is essential to have the people's voice raised at Conference of Parties. And also their ownership is of paramount importance. Without their ownership, people's participation and their ownership, whatever we have enshrined in Paris Agreement, that can't be implemented, executed. So you also raise that issue, that participation, what we have seen, especially in the run-up of WSSD, and also say SDG goals, we have seen that their participation had ensured a better prepared determination of SDGs. That way, we should keep the participation on the rise so that we can have meaningful implementation, full and effective implementation of the convention, as Joanna was articulating that next year it will be 30 years, 30th anniversary of signing of the, say, our dear convention, framework convention on climate change. In 1991-92, we negotiated that, and in 1992, May, it was adopted in New York, and then we took it to Rio in June 1992, put on for signature. So at Art Summit. So next year, it will be the, when we are going to have our SPs, at that time, it will be the 30th anniversary of our UNFCCC convention. So that way, we should look down to ensure the participation of the southern voices along with northern voices. So, Thomas, last 1 minute message, last, say, your closing remark. Thomas.
Well, whatever we want to do, whatever we want to be engaged into as climate action, both in mitigation and adaptation, both in reducing environmental impacts and learning how to live safer in changing climate, we have to, or we rather must not forget about what is the most important priority of Climate Convention and Paris Agreement and Kyoto Protocol and many others, including the Sustainable Development Goals. It's eradication of poverty and securing food for people. What causes problems in the world, the biggest problems, is this unfortunate gap between the rich and the poor. And unless we take away the issue of hunger and malnutrition from the international agenda, unless we can say that extreme poverty does not exist any longer, people will simply not be able to engage in the actions to develop in the more sustainable manner. Of course, it does not apply to the superpowers like the US. The US is probably more concerned about competition with China rather than with extreme weathers. I mean, now it's extreme weather after the tornadoes, but the probably long-term political goals of any administration, not just Trump's administration, that was another extreme. The superpowers and the politicians who are the leaders of the world will rather be looking at the competition issues with the others, with other superpowers. They will be trying to gain competitive advantage, etc., etc. And it's our job, it's the job of climate champion to convince the world that the best way to gain this competitive advantage is to act on climate. the best way to make the economy resilient, efficient, and offering decent jobs. And whatever we do in these areas, it needs to be named an climate action. That's probably the best way of achieving a progress. I'm not saying success, but a progress. Let's be moderate.
Thank you very, very much, Tomasz. You are also a climate champion, as I remember. And hopefully you will continue to be people's climate champion, as Joanna alludes us. The role of climate champions, say, Nigel should play. So with him, like you, Tomasz, and others should join. Joanna, what is your last message? Last 1 minute.
Sorry, thank you very much, Quamrul. Gosh, there's so much that I'd like to say. I think I'll focus on my more positive forward-looking remarks, which is you spoke very powerfully about the need for participation of the South at the COPs. And I think you were focusing specifically on civil society from the South. I think when you said that participants had been, people had been unable to attend when they wanted to, this was specifically the youth, farmers, civil society from the South. And I think that speaks to a couple of really interesting points. One, I think it's so positive that they want to attend, that these people are aware of the climate change problem, and they really want to go to the COPs and make their voices heard. And I think this is something that has really changed over the past few years, is people, communities increasingly being aware of how important climate change is to them, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And I think this reflects something that you were saying, Joe, as well, the need to really bring climate change home to communities. So I think the fact they wanted to go, I think is very positive. I'm very sorry they didn't have the support that they needed to. And I think maybe this is something that the UK presidency and the Egyptian presidency and the Secretariat together to try and put in early a package of support to enable that. But if you think just for a minute how much progress we have made since the very beginning, while Tomasz was talking, I was listening, but I was also trying to find the statistics and the figures for participation of NGOs. And at COP1 in Berlin, I've got the statistics here, there were 1,056 NGO representatives present. I don't know how many were Southern, but I suspect it was a very small percentage. And when you think that in Glasgow we had over 9,500 who were formally registered, you can just see just how much progress we have made on that. And something that I think is really important over the past couple of years has been the rising up of youth. I think this is really where the hope lies. I know certainly in my country, until unfortunately coronavirus put an end to it, the monthly, if not weekly, Friday marches were really starting to impact on the political situation here. So I think if we can maybe take this message coming forward, the importance of Southern participation and the need to really action that going forward to COP27, I think this will be a great note on which to end on, maybe certainly to end my remarks on.
Thank you, Joanna. Hopefully, say COP Presidency will look into this matter because as far as participation of the Southern NGOs, Southern civil society bodies, youths, say in Bangladesh also from British support, it has been the lowest of the low this year. Not even say last couple of years, the participation was higher than this year. So we expected much more. So for Nepal, for Bhutan, for say other countries, the same situation. I have say my information. So that is not quite expected. We have expected much more support from Britain this time, but say even under COVID situation.
I mean, I think
that
it was
is the
partly
case.
COVID And also, I mean, we had the very unfortunate cuts in overseas development.
So for also Africa, same situation. For Latin America, same situation. For say small island developing states, same this time. And Joe, your last take.
So I'll say what Joanna said earlier. Going last is great because you get to kind of bring things together and build on what others have said, which I agree with. I think we need a world that works for everyone. We have to recognize that is the mission for the COP27, COP28, and as we get to climate stability. We have to invest in ways that are good for nature. These two things should give us a lot of guidance about what should happen concretely in the negotiating process and in the parallel processes. Civic engagement and also integrating different kinds of data systems so that we actually know what's happening, so that small farmers can use modern technology, scientific data to do things that are good for nature and get paid for it. We need to make the commitments real, these massive commitments of finance and changing industrial systems. If they're not real, they're not even valuable as words. So we need to focus on making those things real with real early action. We need climate smart, sustainable finance to be the mainstream norm. We have to stop pretending that that is not the logical goal. We should get there as fast as possible. And I think moving some of the pieces on the board that help us get there in the next couple of years, that has to be a big project between now and COP27. And I just go back to that, idea that if we're trying to figure out the most reasonable, most ethical, most actionable global goal on adaptation, it probably needs to be something like zero vulnerability to human-caused climate emergency. But what that looks like in practice, there's a lot to figure out, but there really is no other obviously ethical global goal. And so I think if we can meet those standards, then we're in a good position to actually pull these threads together and avoid persistent climate emergency. That's what we're trying to do, is avoid the unfolding disaster. Can we do all that in 1 year? I don't think we can. But we can set our sights on it. We can get to that place where, in Glasgow, as Joanna said, 1.5 is now the law. That's how I see it. It's recognized as the danger threshold, the mandate of the convention. We can get to the place at COP27 where this world that works for everyone is the unifying goal.
Thank you, Joe. Really. Zero vulnerability to human-induced climatic change can be global goal for adaptation, or one of the global goals for adaptation. And climate finance, as you know, cost of climate finance is going to be sixfold, as earlier emphasized, 6 times more than that. Now the economists are forecasting. So that is the alarm, red alarm. We need to give a heed to that call. And collectively, of course, we must protect this planet, preserve our ecosystems, conserve our nature, fragile nature, ecosystem. Make the best use of our resilient capacities, coping capacities, and also phase out fossil fuel or phase down quite fast, steeply. And that will give us a moral boost to keep alive our dream of 1.5 degree global goal as enshrined in Paris Agreement. Thank you very, very much. It was a great pleasure to have your takes, your reflections, your wise words. The trio, Joe, Thomas, and Joanna, you gave an impetus to our climate science, to climate economics, political economy of it, and also the vision you put forward, hopefully would lead us to Sharm el-Sheikh come November in a much more better equipped, all from the southern to the northern hemisphere, everywhere, from every corner, so that billions of people who are on the hook of adverse impact of climatic changes can be taken off the hook quite soon, at the earliest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And all the best. And all the best for the holidays and the Happy New Year.
Yes, all the best.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Great conversation. Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.
To be honest with you all. Bye.
Time with each other.
Oh, I'm loving this. It's like one of the best things I've done all week.
When you started first time